Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the third round of the FIDE Canada's tournament being held here in Toronto, Canada. Now, yesterday I had a very difficult second round game. I lost to the Indian player, Vidit Santosh Gujarati. But today we're back and I'm playing in the third round. Now, obviously, after a very difficult defeat, you're in a tough situation, especially when you lose with the white pieces, because normally that means you're playing with the black pieces in the following round. Now, my opponent, Nijat Abasov from Azerbaijan, is the lowest rated player in this tournament. He went on a magical Cinderella run in the FIDE World Cup, where he finished in the top 4 to qualify for this event. So, I'm playing against Abasov in his third round, and you might be wondering, what is my strategy? Now, initially, after I lost the game to Vidit, very briefly, I thought about going insane, throwing everything against the wall, and trying to take huge risks. Now, one of the reasons I chose not to do that before we dive into the game is that I feel as though in most of the Canada's tournament, it tends to come down to the last couple of rounds. Whether it be nerves, whether players start going crazy, it feels like normally in the final couple of rounds, anything can happen. And for that reason, I decided to be a little bit more solid. So let's get right into the action. So the game starts with d4. Here I play the move d5, and now we get c4, and I play the Slav defense. Now, Slav defense is an opening that I've not played a lot in recent times. I did play it a lot during the period of 2009 to about 2012, but it's not something that I've played recently. Nonetheless, I decided to try and surprise my opponent. Now, one of the big drawbacks to this opening, of course, is that as we see in the game, Abasov plays what we call the exchange Slav. Now, the reason they call it the exchange is because when you look at the position, you'll notice that we have a mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all, with mirrored pawns on d4 and d5. So basically, white has pushed these two pawns, but after the trade, they're no longer pawns in the c file, and everything is completely symmetrical, and generally, this is not considered an attempt to try and win for the player with the white pieces. However, there also tends to be very little risk as well, and I think my opponent, Abasov, wanted to be extremely solid too. So we get the trade. Now the game continues with knight c3. I play knight f6, knight f3, and now I go knight c6. Now, in this exchange swap, normally if white is trying very hard to win the game, usually you bring the bishop out and then you move this pawn to e3. And the reason for that is white can try to develop this knight to e2 versus putting it on this f3 square. Now, black has many ways to play against the system, but generally if the player with the white piece is trying to win the game, usually it goes something like, let's say, bishop f5, let's just say, actually not bishop f5. Normally black plays something like e6 or a6. Let's just say e6 for argument's sake. Bishop to d3, bishop e7, and now something like knight e2 here, where white gets the two b's out on the diagonals, and white additionally here has these knights developed on e2 and c3, where they connect to each other. However, Abasov plays this move knight f3. And generally, when you get the mirror on the board here with these knights all in the same squares and the pawns on d4 and d5, generally, this is considered to be very dry, and the game tends to trend towards a draw. So, when Abasov played knight f3, I went knight 6. I already was kind of unhappy because I had a feeling this game might be headed down the path of being a very boring draw. Game continues with bishop to f4, and now I play this move a6. Now, of course, those of you guys who've played chess a long time, you're probably wondering why not bishop f5. And in fact, many grandmasters who have made grandmaster draws generally play like this, where you get e3, e6, bishop d3, takes, bishop d6, takes, castles, something like rook d1, rook d8, rook c1, and rook c8. And once again, we have a perfect mirror. All of the pieces are on the identical squares here for both sides. And generally, there are many games that have ended in a draw here. I want to say at least 100 plus games between grandmasters that have finished with something exactly like this. So I play a6 here because, of course, I'm in it for content. I don't want to have a really quick draw. I don't want to play a mirror game. I want to have something to explain to you guys, the fans at home. So I play a6 here, which is a move that stops white from putting either a knight or a bishop here down the road. For example, perhaps white could try and pin the tail on the donkey with bishop b5, pinning the knight on c6. But when I go a6 here right away, it's a prophylactic. It stops knight b5, but it also stops white from putting the bishop on the square as well. So I play a6. The game continues with e3, and now I go bishop to g4 here. h3 is played, and now I trade the bishop for the knight. Queen takes bishop, and I play e6. Here, rook c1 is played, and now I go bishop to d6. Now, in this position, Abasov played the move bishop d3, and this took me very much by surprise. Now, whether it's with this rook c1 move order or the other order with bishop d3, normally white always goes bishop to g5 here, pinning the knight and avoiding the trade of these bishops. After bishop e7, castles, rook c1, the game goes on, and there's a lot of play for both sides. But here, Abasov decides to play rook c1, bishop d6, and bishop to d3, and now I spent a lot of time in this position. Now, there are a couple of reasons I spent a lot of time. To give you guys a little bit of insight into the machinations of what goes on in my head when I play games, surprise, surprise, it is not solely pure chess calculations. There are a lot of things that go into this. First of all, Abasov was moving very quickly. So with Abasov moving quickly, I was thinking to myself, this probably is preparation, or he just wants to make a quick draw. I already thought he might be in the mood to make a draw because this doesn't seem like a very challenging setup. But because Abasov did not go bishop g5, this gave me the option here to spend 30 minutes trying to figure out whether to play this move e5. Now, there is a famous saying, which we do have, of course, in the great Latin language, which is fortis fortuna juvat, which, of course, means fortune favors the bull. Now, I wanted to play this e5 move, but I really was unsure what was happening in the game after this move bishop g5. White can, of course, also trade the pawns on e5 here, as was mentioned by Jan Ludwig Hammer during his live commentary of my game on my Kick channel. But after castles, and rook d1, most likely the game is going to end in a draw. Black has an isolated pawn on d5, but black also has a much better wooden shield with this bishop on the e5 square. So first of all, white can try to make the quick draw with takes, but if I perceive that my opponent Abasov is still in his preparation, there's another option here, which is to play bishop to g5, and now I play this move e4, forking the queen and the bishop. After bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, white has a couple different ways to sack. Probably the best one is to sack the knight with knight takes pawn, takes, and after queen a5, king e2, and king e7, it's very, very unclear what's happening in this position. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 pawns versus 5. So white is down a horse, but in return, he has 2 pawns here. But most importantly, we have the classic double bond cloud with the kings being on e2 and e7. Now, when I was spending the 30 minutes thinking about whether to play e5 or not, this was in my mind. I have to be honest with you guys. I was thinking to myself, okay, we got a double bond cloud in the game. Great thumbnail. It's going to be double bond cloud. Maybe this will get like an extra 20, 30,000 views, if not more. But on the other hand, yes, it's nice and fine. But what happens if I'm wrong and Abasov is still in its preparation and I go on to lose the game from here? Yes, I mean, it is content, but if I lose, that is definitely not a good thing. And that probably means those 20 to 30,000 extra people who will click on the thumbnail are not going to watch my future recaps because I'm no longer in the running to win the tournament. So, I was really thinking about this. This was on my mind during the game whether I wanted to play e5. And ultimately, I rejected it for the fact that white could play this variation where he trades everything off on e5 and the game ends in a draw. And if that happens, it'll be a draw. I would say like 99% sure I'll draw the game. But if I'm wrong and this move is actually a blunder and this whole line with bishop g5 is in fact good for white, I felt that in this double bond cloud position, white has very little risk here. And so if I'm wrong, I'm probably going to lose this position more than 75% of the time. So I felt like the risk reward was simply not there, especially based on the fact that if I lose the second game in a row, most likely my tournament is over in terms of trying to contend for the first place. So because of that, I decided to be a Debbie Downer here and play very boring old man chess by trading the bishops on f4. After bishop takes f4, we get queen takes f4, and now I decide to castle my king, and here Abasov also castled, and now I play this move rook c8. Now, during the game, I was actually briefly considering this move queen to b6 to try and hit this pawn on b2 before white has castled, but after a move like rook b1, castles, I didn't really love my position here for a couple of reasons. White has a very simple, straightforward plan, which is to go rook c1, let's say rook c8, and now let's move knight to a4, bringing the horse to c5 to pressure these pawns on b7 and a6. Let's say queen d8, knight c5, queen e7, and something like rook c3 with rook c1 and a double stack. And the computer thinks black is still fine here, but there is a little bit of pressure because of this horse. So I decide to castle instead. Now we get castles, and I play this move rook c8. Here Abasov plays move queen f3. And this was the moment that I knew that Abasov simply wanted to make a draw immediately. Up to this point, Abasov was still moving instantly, but this move queen f3 is so passive and so quiet and does absolutely nothing here that it's clear that white doesn't have a plan. If Abasov were still in prep, I would have expected him to play something like a3, followed by rook c2 and rook c1 to stack the rooks on the file, but this move simply does nothing other than retreat the queen backwards. Now, unfortunately for me, because of the pawn structure being so symmetrical here, I don't really have great chances to try and win the game. So even though white is playing a move that's not the best move, the pawn structure is so stable that it doesn't really change a whole lot. So here I play queen to d6. Now, another idea I considered was to play knight to e8 here, trying to put the knight on d6. But after a3, knight d6, and knight a4, I simply was a little bit worried that once again, white is jumping with the horse and will have the classic connect 5 and a lot of pressure on the queen side. So I go queen to d6, and here Abasov plays queen e2. Now I play the move knight to d7, and Abasov plays queen d2. Now, once again, these moves are not very exciting. Abasov has moved the queen 1, 2, and now 3 over. But because the pawn structure is so symmetrical and so boring, again, there's no way for me to capitalize on these slightly imprecise moves. So here I play knight e7. Abasov goes knight e2. The idea is very simple. He wants to trade off all these rooks on the c file. Now I play the move g6. The rooks come off. He plays rook c1. I trade, and now I go knight c6 back. Now, at this point, I actually felt knight c6 was not the best move. I kind of felt like, in reality, I should have played queen c7 here, and after knight b3, maybe this move knight c8, so that when white goes queen b4 and I get knight d6, these knights are very, very well placed here on d6 and d7. I can play for b6 and a5 down the road, and it's not to say that I can play for anything more, but maybe there will be some chance for an imbalance later on. Instead, I play knight to c6 here. Abasov goes knight b3, and now I play this move queen b4. Now, queen b4 is completely fine, but it's a way of trying to force the draw immediately. In this position, I also could have played something like king to g7 here, maybe. Perhaps e5 is possible. There are a lot of different ways to play it, but at the end of the day, in a position like this where it's going to be a draw pretty much no matter what I do, there's no reason to try and take any risk here. If I take risk and I'm wrong, effectively, as I said before, my tournament is over immediately. And it's just not a position where a player of Abasov's caliber is going to make a big mistake. So I go queen to b4. Abasov trades the queens, and now he goes bishop to b1 back, and I play this move knight c6. Now, knight c6 is a move that I played on purpose here to try and bait my opponent into playing for more. Now, the reason this move might that I feel like this move might be a little bit imprecise, it gives white the very provocative option of playing knight to c5 here, attacking the knight and the pawn at the same time. Now, the reason this is so provocative is that here I can't just move my knight away, because then I hang the pawn on b7 and lose the game, which means that I have to trade the knights, and now there's a big imbalance, because white is going to try to push a3 and b4 and create a chain of 3 pawns, while I potentially have an extra pawn in the center of the board. So, when I played this move, I was trying to bait Abasov into playing knight c5. I'm going to be honest, I was not 100% sure what was happening in this endgame, but I felt that there was no risk for me here because I played something like knight to e5, and after b3, stopping the knight from jumping to c4, now I go a5, a3, king f8, let's say f4, knight d7, white goes b4 to guard the pawn on c5, swap, knight b8, bishop to d3, and I felt that after knight 6, b5, and knight b8, I might have some slim chance of winning this game with the idea of knight d7. Sample line, say white goes g3, king e7, king f2, and knight d7. Now black is probably winning because after c6, you swap, go knight to c5, attacking the bishop. Let's say you go bishop to c2, king d6. Suddenly white loses his pawn on c6, and black will have 5 pawns versus white's 4 pawns here on the king side, and there are great chances to win the game. So, when I played knight c6, I was really trying to bait Abasov to play knight c5 because it forces an endgame that is not completely clear-cut who's better, but unfortunately for me, Abasov decides to play this move king to f1. Now, this, of course, was a huge disappointment because when he goes king f1, in this position, I finally decided to play the move b6. And the reason I played b6 here is now I was not sure if I go king f8, whether this endgame was still good for me after knight c5. Let's say we trade here, and I play a5, king e2. Computer already, as you can tell from the bar, is starting to think that white might have a very, very small advantage here. And I felt that there was no reason to allow this now with the white king being closer to the center. So I go b6 instead, which takes away this knight c5 square now from the horse. Abasov plays bishop d3, and now the game ends in a repetition after knight b4, bishop b1, knight c6 back, and I play knight b4. Now, of course, in this position, I could play this move knight to b8 here, but after king to e2, let's say I go a5 here, white can bring the king to d2. Let's say I go king f8, king c3, king e7, knight c1, king d6, and a move like bishop to, I don't know, let's say c2, for example. White probably has a very small advantage in this position, simply because you can bring the bishop to this diagonal to pressure the knights. All my pawns on the king side are also on the same color as the slight square b on c2. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to try and play for more. Now, of course, I could have done this, and I'll be honest, if this were a blitz game, for example, I think I would have done this. Probably I would even win in blitz, because generally speaking, in blitz games, knights are better than bishops. Like the knight on c6 would be better than the bishop on c2. But in a classical game of chess where both players have 2 hours for the whole game, that material imbalance that is so critical in blitz simply does not exist. So I simply didn't see any reason to keep the game going, so I play knight b4, bishop b1, knight c6, bishop to d3, and here the game ends by repetition, threefold repetition, and the game is a draw. Now keep in mind, it is not possible to offer a draw before move 40, according to the rules for this candidates tournament, so that's why we had to make the repetition. If not for that, probably the game would have been drawn somewhere around move 20, rather than ending on move number 29. Now, at any rate, it's obviously a little bit disappointing to play a game like this. It would have been nice to get an interesting game. A draw itself is not a big deal. I'm not particularly unhappy about the draw, but the way that came about without that much fight in the game is certainly disappointing. And maybe in retrospect, I should have gone for the classic double bond cloud, because if we got a double bond cloud, that would have been amazing stuff to see in a tournament like the candidates. But unfortunately today, content lost and the game and chess won, I guess you could say, or proper chess won, as the game ended in a draw. But it is what it is. We keep moving forward. Most of the games today were drawn. It does look like my opponent tomorrow, which of course is Ramesh Babu Pragnanantha, who I did lose to in the FIDE World Cup, is on the verge of winning against Vidit Santosh Gujarati, which will put both the players back at an even score. Yesterday, I lost to Vidit, so Vidit went to a +1 score. Prag lost a tough game to Gukesh. But with Prag beating Vidit, both players are back to an even score, as their wins and losses will cancel out. And tomorrow I will be playing against Ramesh Babu Pragnanantha with the white pieces in the 4th round. The final game before we get our first rest day of the event. So I feel pretty good. Today was at least respectable compared to yesterday, and we move forward and we'll see what happens. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the 3rd round of the FIDE Canada's tournament here in Toronto, Canada. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back tomorrow with another recap after the 4th round in this Canada's tournament. See you guys. Bye. That is if I can even figure out how to stop the recording. Sorry, guys.